Thanks everybody for joining us. Really great to see you this morning. We are here to talk about competency-based education and have a really great lineup for you today. Heather, if you could go to the next slide for me. So yeah, welcome, thanks for coming. So excited to have an opportunity to share this great work with you. Please let us know you're here by posting your name and institution in the chat. And just a reminder to mute yourself unless you're speaking. My name is Ginger Reynolds from Education Systems Center, and here with me are my colleagues, John Furr and Heather Penzak from Ed Systems. Also joining us is Whitney Thompson from the Illinois Community College Board. Great, I see you all chiming in. It's great to see you. Thank you so much. So we have a full agenda for you today. Whitney will start us off with some background on competency-based education and ICCB's CBE initiative, and then we'll hear from Parkland and Rend on their plans and progress. Then John will talk about the current regulatory flexibility for CBE and take your questions. And then we'll hear about the CBE Welding program at Lewis and Clark and the GPEAK initiative, and finally some time for feedback and next steps. We will end around 12:30, but feel free to stay on the line until 1 if you want to continue the conversation. We will be here. Next slide, please. Here's what we're hoping to get from you today. We hope you'll be curious. We hope you'll ask questions. We also hope you'll share what you know. This is new to everyone, so we're all learning together. And as for how we'll engage, we love to connect with you. So please feel free to use the chat as we go along to comment. Let us know what you need and engage with each other. I also want to note that we are recording the session, and so we'll post the deck and the recording after the webinar.
So thanks, Ginger. As Ginger said, I'm Whitney Thompson, Deputy Director for Workforce Education for the Community College Board. I'm very excited for today's webinar to really pair and share the advancements and the priorities related to competency-based education.
Hello.
Oh, I think someone's not on mute. That may need to be on mute. So I know that we're all balancing, and as we do Zoom, we're balancing lots of other meetings and such. So, there's been an extensive interest among community colleges and higher education in general to develop and implement competency-based education. And the reason that the Community College Board is so interested is because equity is a priority for Illinois higher education more than ever. And specifically that COVID-19 has really disrupted our system. So, is it a time for more disruption? And we think that CBE could be that disruption. As you can see here, competency-based education focuses on learning and the application of that learning rather than time spent in the classroom. So, what does the learner know? What can the learner do rather than focusing just on seat time? So, and in our traditional model, time is constant, learning is variable. In a CBE model, time is the variable, but learning is always constant. So, if you're looking for sort of a CBE 101, I'll talk about some resources here in a second. We're not going to cover that. That's going to be, we did that in the fall. And so I'm going to point to those resources, but I know that you're very excited to learn what Lewis and Clark's doing. And then of course, our specific initiatives. So, I have on here that CBE is learning centered, it's flexible, it's strategy for advancing educational equity, and it's labor market aligned, all of which are priorities and are really at the center of community colleges. So that's why I think it's really important that the Community College Board help lead this initiative and support our system in this work. You can go to the next slide. So just to kind of introduce the initiative that you will hear from both Rend and Parkland today, as well as Lewis and Clark. We are supporting some grants related to CBE development for two grantees, Parkland and Rend to build capacity and planning for program development which also includes building that institutional support and engagement, really building that knowledge as you build capacity for the next 16 to 17 months. We're partnering obviously with NIU Ed Systems, who has brought you this webinar for today. CBEE, which is a national organization that supports the development of competency-based education, and then also partnering with Lewis and Clark, who is implementing their CBE Welding program for the first time this semester. So this grant really builds off the equity collaboratory that 6 community colleges participated in last year, led by CBEE and JFF. And so, we're very focused on utilizing CBE to address and advance equity in our community colleges. So with that, I do want to point to a few resources. So as I said, if you want to know all the ins and outs of competency-based education in terms of a 101, we have a recording to all of our forum from last fall. So I highly encourage you to review those. We had a great presentation from Christy at Sinclair Community College, who really walked through their local implementation journey. They've been doing CBE for over 10 years in a number of programs. But then CBEE did a 101 presentation for us and really talked about the continuum of competency-based education, the assumptions and beliefs, and really sort of in practice what this looks like, because it really looks different at each institution. And so there's really no one right way to do it. And I think that's why it's been a challenge for folks to really grab hold of CBE and move forward, because it is so broad, and there isn't one right way, one right playbook to do it. So I know we're going to hear from Lewis and Clark in terms of how they're implementing their CBE program. And at this point, I'll turn it over back to you, Ginger, to introduce Parkland.
Great. Thanks so much, Whitney. So now we'll hear from Nancy Sutton, Vice President for Academic Services and Chief Academic Officer at Parkland College, on their CBE plans and progress.
Thank you, Ginger, and thank you, Whitney. So Parkland, as you heard, participated in the Collaboratory that CBEE and JFF had last year. And we used that as an opportunity to do some sort of intensive study into exactly what we wanted CBE to do at Parkland. It was something we've been talking about for years, but we needed a little push to get us started. And we took the Collaboratory opportunity to get the buy-in that we needed and to really kind of formulate where we wanted to go with that. So if you want to go to the first slide, the slides which have way too many words, I don't expect you to read them all, but maybe to give you a little sense of what we thought about in order to start this journey. And the first thing we looked at was trying to decide, where do we really need to focus the CBE? If we're going to pick one place to start, what are we going to do? Manufacturing is an area that there is an abundance of opportunities in our district as well as our neighboring districts, where many of the people that live in our district will travel to areas such as Bloomington, Danville, Decatur. Parkland is centrally located in Illinois, so there's over 26,000 manufacturing jobs. So our advisory boards and our employers really were interested in us doing something to help increase the opportunities that their employees have. So if you want to go to the next slide, we have numerous degrees and certificates within manufacturing. So as you can see, this includes our computer-aided drafting, our industrial maintenance technology, our machining, our welding, electronic controls, and we have the 60 credit hour degrees as well as all the way down to the 16 credit hour certificates. So we're looking at this whole area trying to decide, where does CBE fit? So if you go to the next slide, our particular goals are threefold. We want to strengthen the pipeline for our high school students. We know that we're using the program of study model, but a lot of our families don't understand the potential in manufacturing as a career opportunity. So we want to try to use maybe some of the CBE and the dual credit models to help encourage people to follow this path. Secondly, we want to increase the skills and encourage credential completion among the incumbent workers. And this is something that our employers have talked about, the fact that they'll have an employee who has some skills, but not all the skills. So what can we do with competency-based education to allow the incumbent workers to move through a program, gain additional skills without the additional time and money that it usually takes. And the third is the opportunities for our diverse populations. As we look at the number of women that we have in manufacturing and the number of our African American or Hispanic students, we realize that there are some barriers that we're not addressing. And two of the primary ones have to do with the work and family schedules, as well as the costs. So we're hoping that by developing the flexible scheduling and the prior learning credits that we'll be able to overcome some of those barriers. So those are the three goals. The components of the program, if you go to the next slide, include developing an open lab system where students can choose the times that they want to come in. The integration of the online learning. So if you do a certain amount of it online, then you can come into the lab whenever it's open to demonstrate your competency. Our plan is to take our current 3 and 4 credit hour classes and break them into modular classes, 1 credit hour classes, so that if competencies are identified as fitting into one of those credits, then that means that someone who might come in and know some of the things you would normally learn in a class, now they're not going to have to take the entire class. We're going to be able to give them credit for what they already knew. And hopefully this will speed up the time and reduce the cost. We need to develop an open entry, open exit model. We have that in a couple areas, but not much. And it has to fit within the 15 to 16 week ICCB semester schedule. And then obviously the apprenticeships, continuing in our apprenticeship programs, will be an essential part of this. So the steps that we have to take, if you go to the next slide, the first thing we're starting with are site visits and meetings between the faculty and the employers. We actually have our first site visit scheduled for April. We'll be doing that along with Rend Lake and some folks from ICCB. We're going to visit a few places so the faculty can see how the labs are set up and talk to other faculty who have been doing this. Several of the visits will be, we've talked about Texas, we've talked about Utah. There's several places we have in mind, and we'll be using some of the grant funds to go to as many places as the faculty feel they need to until they're comfortable with what the options are. We need to integrate our non-credit and our credit offerings. And this is something Parkland has not done yet really, is let someone jump between the non-credit and the credit side. We'll do that by trying to clarify our prior learning assessment processes, which we've used, but not as extensive as we intend to for this. Faculty will need to modify the existing curriculum. And then a lot of our planning with our grant is the development of a marketing and recruitment plan where we really get the message out, figure out how it is that we explain to employers, parents, and students the value of CBE and what they can do with it. And so then as you see, we also have the collaboration with our advising services, with admissions and financial aid, all the way down to presenting to our district high schools and industry partners exactly what we're doing. We don't intend, Parkland doesn't intend to try to break out of some of the traditional things we do. We're going to transcript the same way with grades, but we're going to break it into 1 credit hour courses if possible. That's our initial plan. I'll be joined in this with a team that includes the Dean of CTE, the department chair over the manufacturing area, and 3 faculty, many of whom are on this call right now. So we do have the participation. The faculty are going to be driving this because they're the ones who know this area the best, and they're the ones who've been working the most with the employers. So we're very hopeful that at the end of a year that we're going to be piloting something that we actually will have a model that we'll be able to put into other areas as well.
Great, thank you so much, Nancy. And now I'll turn it over to Lori Ragland, Vice President of Instruction and Student Affairs at Rend Lake College, to tell us about their plans and progress for the CBE.
Thanks, Ginger. Good morning, everyone. If you want to advance to the next slide. Our project focus is to develop a competency-based education and program, or a competency-based education program in welding. Next slide, please. As far as need, a competency-based option will assist with student barriers when it comes to enrollment, retention, and completion. Due to the time commitment of attending college courses in addition to working a full-time job, many individuals only complete 1 basic welding course and then enter the workforce in a low-paying entry-level position. Many times, personal demands to make a living prevent them from continuing their education. A CBE program would allow students to apply prior knowledge and experience to expedite progress. Those employed in seasonal positions would be able to enroll during their downtime due to flexible scheduling. And then incumbent workers, they would be able to improve their skills by completing online modules and participating in open lab hours outside of their normal work hours. Since CBE programs allow for open entry and exit points, there is a greater opportunity to serve underrepresented students and improve equitable outcomes. Our traditional program structure for welding shows gaps in females and Black students. Barriers include lack of flexibility in our semester schedule, the required time commitment with no guarantee of a job, and lack of coaching and focused program support. So our target audience will include underrepresented minorities, economically disadvantaged, incumbent workers to advance in the field, full-time employees in other career fields looking to advance and need flexible training schedules, and integrated education and training students, or our adults who are working on their GED at the same time as CTE training. Based on feedback from our industry partners, competency-based education would better meet their needs. In addition to the seat time requirement, employers indicate frustration when students pass a course but have not mastered a specific skill. By implementing a badging system, employers will know an individual's proficiency in explicit skills as opposed to an overall grade for a course. And then finally, CBE and welding would help reduce the workforce gap. Welding is an in-demand occupation in our region, as well as in Illinois and across the United States. Labor market data shows a 4% growth for welders in our local workforce area, a 2% growth in Illinois, and an 8% growth across the country. So on the next slide is our theory of change statement. I won't read through our statement, but some program features to support this change include self-paced courses that meet students where they are at as far as prior knowledge and experience. The courses will focus on the students' learning and mastery of skills instead of on the seat time. Students will have to demonstrate competencies, which allows for personalization of the instruction based on where the student is struggling. And then a success coach with an equity-focused lens to work closely with the faculty and student. Then I mentioned earlier, implementing a badging system for portability of the competencies an individual has mastered. Next slide, please. As far as our action plan, we are currently focusing on professional development and providing training to our CBE team. Topics include what exactly is CBE, aligning curriculum with competencies, optional funding models, available technology, and student support models. Next, we will develop our CBE welding program, which includes identifying competencies and aligning to curriculum. This will heavily involve our local employers to be sure they are in agreement with our competency requirements. Our instructional designer will be involved to help build the program modules in Canvas. Development also includes the program logistics such as scheduling, cost, and prior learning assessment. Again, implementing a badging system to track competencies, plan a coaching and support system. Success coaches will especially be able to help those who lack family support and role models to improve their self-confidence and identify solutions to barriers. We will then market and recruit for the program. We plan to pilot at least one course in the spring of 2023 and offer a welding certificate in the fall of 23. Program assessment will be crucial. This will involve IR and gathering of data and tracking performance benchmarks for continuous improvement, and then plan for an expansion. We are looking at industrial electronics and other manufacturing pathways, as well as explore gen eds in order to offer AAS degrees in a CBE format. Next slide. So what I have learned thus far is that there is a lot of gray area when it comes to CBE. What works for one institution may not work for another. So we are in the very early stages and still have a lot to learn, but I'd be happy to discuss further with anyone interested. there's my contact information on the slide.
Thanks, Lori. We do have a question in the chat. How easy or difficult have you found it to be to develop competencies? Do you have some successes and challenges to share?
We have not started that part of the project yet. That is something that welding, I think, already has a lot of competencies, built into that program. So speaking with our faculty, they're not anticipating that to be a huge challenge, but we haven't gotten that far.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks. And I know we will hear from Travis and Lewis and Clark in a little bit. And I know he'll speak to that a little bit too. So thanks for the question, Robin. And thanks, Lori. So now we'll hear from John Furr, who is the founder and executive director of Education Systems Center, on the current legal and regulatory considerations for CBE. John?
Great. Thanks, Ginger. I'm going to go ahead and attempt to share my slides here. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak with you all today about legal and regulatory considerations for community college innovation. Again, I'm John Furr, the Executive Director of Ed Systems. I am a lawyer by training, but have been learning a lot in this space. So that kind of goes to some of the caveats that I want to share just at the outset. I am presenting information here for discussion. I know that many of you have lived and practical experience with the issues that I'm going to be talking about today. So would really love, as we're working through, if there's anything that you hear and you're like, oh, actually, that needs a little bit more nuance, or there's more questions that we should have, please add that in the chat, and I'll ask Ginger and Heather to kind of point out things that might come up in the chat as we're going through. And also, this is pretty complicated stuff, right? Kind of navigating between the ICCB and the accreditors and the U.S. Department of Ed requirements. Well, we are here to help. And so I think that's really part of the project with ICCB, and with really appreciate the Parkland's and Rend Lake's leadership, and Lewis and Clark as well, those who are at the leading edge of this work. We want to be able to kind of work out these issues together with all of you as we move forward. So in kind of talking through today, and we've actually already heard kind of some of these concepts in just the initial presentations, I want to spend some time beginning to unpack sort of three related concepts. So one is around prior learning assessment, the second is around distance education, and the third is a concept of competency-based ed. And within this concept of CBE, there's really sort of two flavors of that, right? One is when you're actually working within that credit hour structure and adhering to those requirements. And the other is moving to a direct assessment model. And I'll kind of dive in and talk about each of those. But where I'd like to start is kind of talking about prior learning assessment, because this is a sort of very closely related cousin of CBE work that oftentimes kind of comes in as you're thinking about CBE models. So it's really important to at least start there and to understand, all right, what's the regulatory landscape for prior learning and how does it maybe tie into your overall work? So for prior learning, what do we generally mean by that, right? That is learning that is obtained outside of the institution that hasn't been officially awarded as academic credit. And that can be from someone's experience, the personal, professional, even high school related experience, but not in dual credit or dual enrollment, right? That's when they're taking a community college class. Another experience that might have in high school, workforce training, military. So there's a lot of places where that prior learning can come from. And then there's a concept of that being validated. So having institutional processes that are evaluating and recognizing prior learning and identifying what's the appropriate level of academic credit that should be there based on institutional standards. And there's lots of ways to validate prior learning, right? So one, I think most of you are obviously familiar with the assessment-based or standardized test. The advanced placement process is really a way to recognize prior learning, where we have kind of legislative and constructs around that. There's also CLEP test, which is another way on the standardized test framework. But you can have college examination. So it would be equivalent to a comprehensive final exam that you might put in place with evaluation under some ICCB's rules by a dean or a designated expert around that. There are also sort of published guides that get at prior learning, including ACE, the American Council on Education. That also has like a whole credit review process where we've seen that used for some workforce training programs where they've gone through that ACE credit review to kind of identify what should be the credit that should be tied in with those programs. And last but not least is kind of portfolios. And I know there's some emerging work in kind of the prior learning CBE space, like for IT portfolios, like programming or web development or other areas, to be able to use that model to understand prior learning. So, excuse me, I'm battling a little bit of a cold as I have sniffles here. So as we look at the Title IV requirements, though, and the ICCB requirements, there are some restrictions and parameters that you have to keep in mind. So particularly from the federal government's perspective for federal financial aid, so prior learning assessment is not eligible for federal financial aid. And there's a very important concept that from the federal government standpoint is that it only applies to acquisition of new learning, not the process of transcribe prior learning as part of that process. And then from the ICCB standpoint, there's sort of a rule of sort of a 25% rule you might look at, where from an ICCB standpoint, they would expect that there would be at least 15 credit hours for a degree program that would have to be completed at that college before prior learning can be awarded, and also for a certificate, that kind of 25% expectation. One other thing this is in the ICCB rules is that colleges are only supposed to be charging for the cost of the prior learning assessment, not for the amount of credit awarded. So obviously, if you're using AP credit, there's no cost. You've kind of got the assessment, the standards for that. But if you do have a process where you need deans or others to review a portfolio, to look into those models, then there is the ability to kind of recapture those costs associated with that. What should that be? It varies a lot. You sometimes hear about a standard of 50% of a credit hour cost, but that is not a specific rule or expectation. That's just what you begin to see in some context. So as you're thinking about the prior learning space, really begin to think about, like, how are you utilizing prior learning within your overall college's systems, right? Are you doing some of the things that are getting at sort of the existing workforce, or are you really kind of focused more on the traditional student pipeline, like maybe for AP or for articulated credit? There's the real opportunity to look at industry credentials, military and workplace learning, workforce training programs, and even that non-credit to credit, right? Oftentimes the vehicle that you translate that non-credit learning to credit is going to be through prior learning. So I think that's one thing for you to consider as you're walking away is really, where are your systems in place for prior learning, and how can they begin to address some of the equity and adult goals that we have? And again, Ginger and others, let me know if there's any questions that pop up in the chat that I should be tackling here.
We had some, I think, unrelated questions, but we're all good. So
okay,
going. Yep.
Great. So the next area that kind of ties in as well to the CBE framework is distance education. And you're all very familiar with distance education. That's what much of you have been doing since March 2020, right? As processes around distance education. But there are certain regulatory parameters that apply to that, which oftentimes connect in really closely to CBE components. And that's what I want to get into a little bit more specifically, are those specific parameters. So generally much of this kind of ties into the framework of contact and credit hours, right? And you heard some, Nancy kind of speaking to this before, right? So there are rules that talk about content around contact hour guidelines, which your courseworks generally need to meet. And that's an expectation that there be, for lecture courses, 1 semester credit hour for each of those 15 classroom contact hours, which is kind of assuming that 2 hours of outside study. For lab, it's a little bit more of a 1-to-1 ratio, right? 30 to 45 classroom contact hours, 1 hour of outside study. And then so for that 1 hour for the credit hour, that clock hour, there are further rules from ICCB around instructional time. So that contact hour is looking at that concept of 50 to 60 minutes of instructional activity, but with lots of options to address that. It could be classroom, could be online, could be laboratory, clinical or work-based instruction, or any combination of those, right? So you've got this concept. Again, you need to meet, let's say for a lecture course, that 15 contact hour expectation. And then you've got to make sure that you have that kind of 50 to 60 minute threshold for instructional activity, which is getting into that instructional time threshold. Now, this is where there's some new changes in the Title IV regs. So there was a major rulemaking by the U.S. Department of Education that was finalized last fall, which had some changes for federal financial aid, how they're looking at concepts of clock hours, which add some new concepts, which really get at that distance ed component. So one of the things is that there's no longer a requirement that clock hours under the Title IV regulations be synchronous. Right? And that was a pretty big change in terms of regulations, allowing that flexibility for asynchronous instruction. But there still needs to meet that 50 to 60 minute threshold. So there's a couple of different ways it can be done with that. this first kind of criteria here under A is looking at a synchronous class, of course, that still meets it, or you can have an asynchronous class as long as there's an opportunity for direct interaction between the instructor and the students. Or you have the ability to have an asynchronous learning activity that involves this concept of academic engagement with technology that can monitor and document the amount of time that students are participating in that activity. So those are both really core concepts. You've got to meet that definition for academic engagement. And you also have the ability to have the technology to monitor to what extent students are participating within that time frame. And there's a number of examples there that are within the regs about what meets a concept of academic engagement. Of course, again, synchronous coursework, that works, but also submitting an assignment, taking an assessment, being part of an interactive tutorial, webinar, or other interactive computer-assisted instruction, which could be a lot of different things. Or students coming together in a discussion that's assigned by the institution. So it's not just them text messaging offline about what their weekend plans are. It's actually the institution saying, hey, we're going to have this group time that's going to be involved around our particular class matter, or other ways that they're interacting with the instructor. So it can't just be that the student logs in and is supposed to watch a video without any further participation. It's got to go beyond that, but there is much more flexibility within that concept for meeting the academic engagement expectation that are now part of those regs. And there's another overlay. So academic engagement kind of gets at that 50 to 60 minute for the clock hour, but there's also the expectation that over the course or over the particular competency unit that you're addressing, that there's the ability to demonstrate regular and substantive interaction. And so that has to be met for some, but not all clock hours. So it's not the case that all 15 hours, if you're doing a lecture course, have to meet the regular and substantive interaction, but you do need to make sure that you're addressing the substantive interaction criteria over the length of that course. And what's expected with that is that your course model is engaging students in teaching, learning, and assessment with at least 2 of these criteria that are there. Again, that concept of direct instruction, it's always going to be able to meet it there. The assessing or providing feedback on students' coursework, responding to questions, group discussions, or the broad other category, right? So lots of flexibility. Unlike that clock hour requirement, which you do have to monitor and track, you don't have to document the exact amount of time spent on substantive interaction. You just have to demonstrate that you're kind of meeting that, again, over the overall course and over the overall competency unit that you're putting in place. So as you're thinking about the distance education new rules and some of the federal flexibility, as we are emerging from COVID, fingers crossed, please, let's hope so, what are some of the practices that you started to put in place which actually should be maintained and maybe can be expanded to support different types of learners within your institution? And also think about what you might have put in place from a technology standpoint that would allow you to take advantage of some of that new flexibility for clock hours and for substantive interaction. Great, so those are 2 kind of, again, related concepts that I wanted to walk through before we even got into the concept of CBE, right? Because those 2 areas are not CBE by definition, but they relate closely to it, and they can be part of your overall package that you're thinking about from a program standpoint. So as we get into CBE, first of all, I want to go back, as Whitney talked about, there are some certain core tenets for this work. This concept that the expectations of learning are held constant, but time is a variable for that work, right? That's kind of the core definition. And also the system for flexibility and self-paced. I think Whitney also highlighted rightly, this is a strategy for advancing educational equity. That's certainly important. And thinking about the labor market alignment also. But it's really this concept, again, about time, having flexibility with time, and that self-pacing, which kind of gets at the core structure of CBE. So what you oftentimes see with kind of CBE models around the country is that they're really working within that credit hour structure, right? So they're kind of taking the rules that I just talked about for distance ed and for credit hour and are using them in such a way so that they're kind of getting at those core tenets of allowing some variability for how fast students can kind of move through and how they're allowed to kind of self-pace within that work. So that's, again, essentially looking at how do you make sure you're meeting the academic engagement expectations for those 15 clock hours for how you set that up? How do you make sure there's substantive interaction? but beyond kind of those credit hour requirements, really allowing for that self-pacing to occur based on individual students' needs. One of the things I think that we oftentimes hear, you're going to hear this come up, is even though you're allowing for self-pacing, it's oftentimes allowing students to accelerate. I think what you still hear are challenges about students who may need longer than that semester time frame to complete the course, and that gets into issues of satisfactory academic progress, which is another kind of Title IV concept. And also there's issues for even reporting. I mean, we've heard, and Travis, I don't want to steal any of his thunder, but he's talked to us a little bit how with reporting to the clearinghouse, if students there's only certain set time limits for reporting, and that begins to get tricky if we're sort of extending beyond in certain areas. So this is an area I think for the field to explore more, and maybe I think for us to dive in more. How do we think about those systems where individual learners might need more time rather than able to move more quickly? We've seen in some high school models that some high schools have incomplete designations that they hold for the student while they finish up. So it's kind of a question, do you have some existing systems that you can kind of leverage and begin to adapt to allow for that greater time flexibility on the back end, not just allowing those students to speed up who are ready to move through. But what's truly different is thinking about direct assessment, right? And so the direct assessment program, again, this is a definition from the federal regs that you can see there. So that is a program that in lieu of credit or clock hours as a measure of student learning is utilizing direct assessment of student learning or recognizes the direct assessment of student learning by others. So what's different here is that you just can't quite get away from credit hours in this game, right? We've always got to tie back to it. So there has to be a methodology to reasonably equate credit hours, but you don't have to have the same time equivalency, right? So you're not stuck within that sort of 15-minute monitoring for the 15 hours. You have to be able to essentially map somehow your competency units and what you're assessing to a reasonable equation for that analysis. One important thing to understand is that, and this is actually, I think, a new clarification within the federal regs, is that a program at the program level, it can be partially direct assessment and partially credit hour based, right? So you could have some coursework, maybe you think your welding classes are really ready for that direct assessment, but you think your English classes, well, you can kind of do credit hour flexibility, you can't go all the way to direct assessment. That's okay now. You can have that mixing and matching. But this last bullet point, again, sort of gets us back to this issue. As you think about direct assessment, you're still running up against that prior learning restriction for federal financial aid, right? So you can't use federal financial aid for prior learning in the direct assessment program. It only has to apply to the acquisition of new learning. But when you look at really closely at the federal regs and the commentary, there is language about, well, is it earned exclusively on the basis of prior learning? And if it's not exclusively on the basis of prior learning, there might be some flexibility there. So I think that's something that could be explored. If you were still reinforcing and supporting different concepts that an individual might earn with them and kind of bring into the program, but it's not exclusively prior learning, there might be the ability to think about how that can be incorporated in the model. So the approval process, the U.S. Department of Ed does require the approval when an institution offers a direct assessment program for the first time at each level of offering. So if you're offering a bachelor's degree program for the first time, or an associate's degree program, a certificate, you do have to get that federal approval to make sure that they are kind of signing off on your institutional systems for the award of financial aid. But again, that is kind of moving away from the previous expectations that each program would have to be approved. At the SCCD level, nothing is established yet. So that's kind of a question, is if there are colleges that want to go down this direction, whether there might be an opportunity for new regs. And in kind of closing out, I want to highlight one state that is tackling this, the state of California, has recently proposed some new direct assessment regulations. It could be a model for Illinois as we're looking at this. And I just want to highlight a couple things from what California is looking at. One of the things is that when you look at the direct assessment federal requirements, it's a little bit murky whether that regular and substantive interaction requirement kind of carries over, but I think it kind of does, but it's not crystal clear. But California has brought that through in their regs, but I think personally have a much better definition of regular substantive interaction than the feds do. So I really like these kind of 8 criteria that they were really laying out the ways that, again, that individual learners could have that interaction within the learning environment. And I thought that was a good guideline and a good model for that. they've also really gotten into this question of grades. And I think sometimes when you want to dive into CBE work, or we've seen this at the high school level as well, like you get really excited and you want to say, hey, we want to get rid of all grading in this. We just want it to be competency-based. And that doesn't always quite work, right? For transfer, for expectations of individuals engaging in these programs, for lots of reasons. So they have what I thought was a quite interesting system for translating their competency grading system to the more traditional 4.0 letter grade structure, where there's a definition of mastery, which means that a student would have a minimum of 80% on the summative assessment, or mastery with distinction, M+, or if you got 90% or higher. And then there's the ability for to mark within that a progress withdrawal. So if a student didn't, they allow students 3 attempts under the regulations for summative assessments that are at the competency level, and that would be indicated if they weren't meeting those thresholds of mastery within those three attempts. And then translating that M to a B and that M+ to an A, with the expectations that colleges would have kind of dual transcripts as part of that work. So again, I thought that was a useful, interesting approach within their regs to how they're thinking about grading issues, which might provide some helpful guidance if you're thinking about that locally as well. So in closing out, just want to, again, pose some additional questions. Do you have any courses or programs that have been offered as a distance in a distance ed model, which maybe could be converted or maybe begin to emphasize more of those CBE components, get into those asynchronous components with the academic engagement flexibility that could be built in? And also, where might a direct assessment model help you to achieve your goals, whether that's in apprenticeships, in dual credit, sometimes like aligning the high school year to the community college academic calendar can be tough. Direct assessment could support that with other CT related work, and really thinking about weaving together, right? So how do you bring together prior learning? How do you bring together that distance ed flexibility? How might you be able to weave in some direct assessment to address the innovation and the equity related goals that you have for your institution? And last but certainly not least, what other information analysis can we help provide? Because we definitely would like to do that. So again, I know that's a lot that I've covered, and happy to answer anything that came up in the chat.
Hey, John, we do just have from Karen that I believe that HLC needs to approve CBE programs, and Jolene says, yes, they do. But you go through it once and no approval required after that. And then Whitney says, for credit-based programs, for direct assessment, all programs must be approved. Anybody else want to jump in? You could also feel free to take yourself off mute and jump in. Sorry, go ahead, John.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I did not get deeply into the HLC requirements, but I appreciate those being added in the chat. So thank you.
I think people are processing. Takes a lot.
Great. Well, I know that we'll be sending out kind of these slides, and definitely appreciate as folks are starting to process and reflect on them. So we'd be happy to follow up with any other questions or clarifications or other suggestions for how might we best be able to build out this information to provide useful guidance to the field. So I think that'll be kind of our next steps from this presentation is looking at ways that we can round out some of the HLC expectations within this and address any other comments or thoughts that folks have.
Great, thanks, John. Heather, if you want to get us back to the deck, that'd be great. So we have the pleasure of hearing from Travis Jumper, Associate Professor and Welding Technology Coordinator at Lewis and Clark Community College, on their new CBE welding program. I feel like this is the highlight of our day because he's really figured out a way to make it work. So Travis, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, I don't know if I'd call it a highlight, but since everybody else is done, I think I get the rest of the hour, right? So, all right, so a little bit about myself, a little bit of my background. So I've been here at Lewis and Clark for the last 10 years. I was first exposed to competency-based education in my master's degree program back in 2010. So when I started the program here at Lewis and Clark, we actually built it on the CBE model 10 years ago. So we've really been doing it unofficially for the last 10 years. So since we were able to get it all processed through HLC and all that kind of stuff. So now this semester, we've actually started to implement it in its full official kind of setup. So Heather, I think you're running the slides for me. Is that right? There we go. So, all right. So about our program, we've got 17 welding classes that all have the CBE kind of broken down for each one of them. We also have 6 general ed classes that are part of the CBE program here. That allows us to offer all 11 of our certificates and degrees. So we do have an associate's degree in welding tech. We have a certificate of proficiency in welding tech, and then we have 10 other certificates of completion in various levels of breakdown. So Heather, if you want to go to the next one. So for our general ed, we have our English class, 131, which is just a first year English class. We've got our lit class, multicultural American literature. We've got our speech class. We've got a history class. We've got a math class, and we got a physical geography. So that allows us to cover all 6 of our gen ed. So our English, our speech, humanities, fine arts, and then 6 hours of math or science. So and if you want to go to the next slide there. So as an example of our English class, so the big thing is each competency is broken down. So we kept our classes in the whole credit hour breakdown. So this is still a 3 credit hour class. But what we ended up doing is the instructor for that English class broke down the class into individual competencies and then assigned a credit hour equivalency basically to that. So you'll see on subsection A, that's a half a credit hour equivalency for the, basically knowledge level of the writing and editing. They have to complete that competency to be able to move down to subsection B, which is another half credit, and so on and so forth. So they actually have to process through the course using each of those subsection. And I let the individual instructors kind of break down what that is, but I help walk them through kind of the concept of how the competencies work, that kind of stuff. The important part there is that you're breaking it down and having some sort of a final project for each one of those competencies, so that if a student does come in with prior learning, they can basically just complete either, like I think that first one, she does a written exam on that one. So as long as they can pass that written exam with at least a 75 is what we do here, then they can move on to the next one. But if they need to practice more, they have to get at least a 75 before they can move on to the next subsection. So it's more about the students are, able to hit that mastery level of a 75 to be able to move on, and they can spend as little or as much time as they need to get to that level. And most of our gen ed classes are kind of broken down in the same general idea. So if you want to go to the next slide. So as part of our actual welding program, we've got, of our 17 classes, we've got 5 of them here that are pretty much lecture only. So our intro to welding industry, our metallurgy, our print reading, our CWI prep class, and then our internship, which the internship is lecture only technically, but the students do work 80 hours outside of that class, in the job market somewhere. So it's the part they do for me is lecture, but they still work outside of class. So if you want to go to the next one there. So the way I've got that, the lecture classes broken down again as an example. Again, I took that 3 credit hour class and we broke that down into individual subsections. And I broke the chapters of that down into units, and then each unit has its own exam. So one of the things that we do for our lecture classes is most of our lecture classes are designed to prepare a student to become, or to take the exam to become a certified welding inspector. So what we do is to pass those exams, you have to have at least a 72. So what we do is we make the students have at least a 75, so they're a little bit over. But what we do is each one of those has an individual unit exam. And then at the end of the subsection D, they have a final exam that encompasses the entire course. And that exam is the same type of exam that the CWI exam is. It's a 150 question true false matching, and you got to get a 75 to pass it. So that's kind of, we tied these classes back to that, industrial certification that the American Welding Society uses. So we're tying all these courses back to industry recognized credentials in some form or fashion, pretty much across the board. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. So when we get into our actual hands-on courses, we've got stick welding classes. We've got 3 of those that are 3 credit hours a piece, so it's 9 total. We've got 3 classes or 2 classes for MIG welding and 1 class for flux core. And then we've got 2 classes for TIG welding. All those classes are strictly related to plate welding on carbon steel. If you want to go to the next one, please. Then our other ones, we've got our oxy fuel cutting and welding. We've got pipe welding. We've got non-ferrous, which is on stainless and aluminum. We've got fabrication and layout, which is on, building parts, reading prints, that kind of stuff. And then we've got our testing and inspecting, and that class is about learning how to test welds, break welds. And that class there is about a 50-50 lecture and lab. So the students will kind of have a mixture of those. So if you want to go to the next slide there. So this is our 3 stick welding classes and kind of how we got those broken down. So inside of each 3 credit hour class, we've broken it down by the number of equivalent credits. So our first class, our 194, we focus on 60-10 welding. So flat position, 60-10 joints, and then horizontal, vertical, overhead. And then we do what's called the X plate, which is just a giant plate where the students are stacking welds and learn how to, layer stuff like that. But each one of those is broken down individually. So if somebody comes in, they've got prior learning experience or they've got prior work experience or something like that, we have an actual weld joint or a final exam for each one of those. So if a student wants to test out of the first stick welding class, they've done 60-10 in high school or whatever, we have those students weld out a sample, just like what the final exam would be for that 194 class. If they can pass that, then we give that student credit. The way that our college does previous credit is when they take the exam with me or whatever, I can fill out paperwork and it sends it over to the registrar. The students end up paying, I think it's $20 a credit hour or $10 a credit hour. So they can get that prior credit for about $60 and be able to bypass that class. So, but you'll notice on the far right-hand column there, you'll see the prerequisites. So you'll see they have to complete the flat positions before they can go on to horizontal before they can go to vertical, and so on and so forth. They also have to complete the X plate with 60-10 before they can sign up for Weld 195, which is the second class. You'll see the prereq for that is 194E basically. And so on the second set of classes, they'll go through the 670-18s. They can, again, test out of those as needed. Then in the third class, that's when we get into our V groove plates. So V groove plates, we do 1/2 inch in all 4 positions, and then we'll do 3/4 inch in all 4 positions. And those, they will use both 60-10 rods and 70-18 rods. So they have to have those first 2 classes done previously. But if somebody comes in and they've got, welding experience, they can test out of 196 by completing a bend test on it, just like a D11 structural steel bend test, would do for on a job site or something like that. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. So a big thing that we did, you had to build a rubric. So this way we have a rubric on how and I know this is tiny on the picture, but so for all of our hands-on assignments, any of our hands-on classes, they all have a similar rubric to this. And I don't know, you can't really see it very well, but in that red at the very top, all of our students have to score at 90% on the rubric to be able to pass each of those competencies. So for them to be able to move on, they have to, weld up whatever joint it is, and then use this rubric to grade it. As long as they got a 90 or better, that is sufficient to, complete that competency, and then they move on, as they progress through the work. So I think having that rubric is key to, especially for HLC, that way that you can see, there's a way to prove basically what that student is able to do and perform at the same level as a student in a traditional class or whatever. But we use this rubric for all of our classes, so it's used across the board. So next slide, please. As far as how we keep track of the students' time, because for financial aid and stuff like that, there is that concept, as John was talking about, is kind of that time aspect of it. We actually utilize time clocks. So each student will be assigned a time card for each course that they're enrolled in. And so when they show up, they'll punch in, they'll work on that class for however long they want to work on it, whatever days they want to work on it. And when they leave for that day, they punch out. And so there isn't necessarily a required amount of time that they have to be in the shop, but this is how we keep track of how much time they're doing it. Because if a student does have previous experience, they should be able to weld through a lot faster than others. But at least this way, we have a way to kind of document the amount of time the students are spending in the class for each particular one. So they'll be assigned a time clock for each class that they're enrolled in. So some students will have, 2 or 3 time clocks, and they'll punch in for each, individual class as they're doing it. So the way that we have our setup is we have our traditional instructors in the classrooms teaching our traditional class times. And as long as there's a welding booth available, the CBE students can come in as long as they punch in, and then they can get assistance from whatever instructor is in the room with whatever they're working on. So they don't necessarily have, they can't trump a student in a traditional class out of a booth. So if there's not space available, then they'll have to come back at a different time. And I seen on the chat just popped up a minute ago. There's myself, and I have one other full-time instructor, John, and then I have 5 adjuncts or 5 part-time instructors. We have classes. I don't know if this is in the slides or not, but we run classes from 8 in the morning until 10 o'clock at night, Monday through Thursday. And then in the fall semester, we also do 9 to 5 on Fridays. And then we usually do our non-credit stuff on Saturdays. So there's usually people in the shop most of the times people want to come in. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. So next thing you got to do is kind of work on the buy-in around campus. So obviously like me as the welding instructor, I can't run all this by myself. I have to have other things going on. So if you go to the next slide. So the first people you got to get your buy-in with is all your welding instructors in your program. Make sure that they understand the difference between, the CBE versus the traditional classes as far as when the students are going to be there, how much time they're going to be there. Get them to understand that they will have students that they may not know coming in and out of their traditional classes, and then they got to help kind of with each one. So it's really key that all of your instructors are comfortable with all of the classes that you offer. So if you've got instructors that are, stick welders, MIG welders, whatever, they really need to be comfortable with instructing in each area of all of the classes across the board. So the next one is you got to get your advisory board on board with it, so they understand kind of how that works with the curriculum and that kind of stuff. And that really helps with when you have students that are in the field that need to get additional training for something in their job, that these advisory board members know how to like push those students here and say, okay, hey, you need this other certification, go to Lewis and Clark, take these 3 classes, get that cert done. We'll pay for you to do it on work hours. Just get it done in the next 2-3 weeks, that kind of stuff. I've got a couple of people that their employers allow them to come to the college here 2 days a week. But some of them work out of town for weeks at a time. So that's really helped with them being able to, like in the weeks they're home, they can come in and really hammer out stuff, during work hours. And then on the weeks away, they're obviously working, wherever they're working. So the next people you got to get buy-in with is the instructors around campus outside of the welding program. So your general education. So a lot of general education are not real familiar with CBE in this modality. So taking the time to explain how it works, and get them on board is kind of, it took me a little while around campus to find some folks that would go ahead and venture in and try to do this for the first time. So it really takes a lot of one-on-one conversation with those gen ed faculty members to get them to understand how it works. So as the welding instructor, you really need to know the ins and outs of the CBE, so you can explain it to the gen ed folks so they know, because they're going to ask a ton of questions. So you need to know how to answer those, as they come up, and that kind of stuff. So if you go to the next slide, please. So next would be your support services. So your advisors, we've actually changed to a different model here at Lewis and Clark, where we actually have program specific advising. We've switched away from the last name advising. So what that made it really nice, because now I have one advisor to send all my students to, and I say, okay, Matt, go see Matt. He knows what's going on. So I was able to sit down with him and really get into the weeds about how the class is run. So it's very, very important. A lot of this stuff, there's prerequisites for one class to the next. So making sure those advisors understand that, understanding that like if a student can't enroll in the pipe class until they've already got stick welding and MIG welding and TIG welding done, because those are all things they need to know how to do before they try to do pipe welding or things like that. So really getting that advisor to understand the process of how these classes work together, and kind of get them to understand that. And then also really explaining, like in our situation, the way we do it is with the time clocks. So having them understand that those students have to be self-motivated, and they have to know there isn't anybody that's going to be emailing you constantly saying, hey, you need to come into the shop, because these are done at your own pace when you want to, when you're available. So it's, those students really, really need to understand that this is a self-motivated model where it's on them to make sure they don't wait until a week and a half before the end of the semester to get something done. So, so what we do, the welding instructors, any students that are under their CBE model, if we don't hear from, we'll usually send an email and say, hey, we got 12 weeks left. Hey, we got 10 weeks left. We got 8 weeks left. Make sure you're find some time to come in the shop, get in the shop and get some stuff done, and things like that. So the other support services would be your financial aid folks. So make sure you're sitting with them and get them to understand how the enrollment process works, because we don't always just enroll at the beginning of the semester. We'll enroll at the beginning of semester, 12 weeks in, 8 weeks in. So they really need to understand that if a student has a loan or grant or scholarship and they get that big giant refund check back, they need to know if they re-sign up for a class in one of the 12-week or 8-week that they've already gotten some of that money back. They have to use that for the next class. It's not, it's not just sitting there like it normally would for beginning of the semester. So next slide, please. Then obviously your administrators. So make sure you work with your deans to know both the deans for your gen eds and the deans for your program if it's a different person. So make sure they understand the advantages of CBE and how that functions and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, I think there's a lot of administrators on here today, so that's great. So and then obviously the next thing you got to is figure out how the most useful use of the instructor's time. So I heard one of the schools, I can't remember if it was Rend Lake or Parkland or whatever, but one of you talked about doing open lab design. I think that's a great model. The issue that you run into there is how do you determine what instructors are going to be in what shop space with, that kind of stuff, so we're still on a traditional credit hour system where we get paid based on our credit hours that we teach our traditional classes. And then we're currently doing pro rata pay for any of our CBE. So any students that come in, we'll assign them into different classes. Like if a class fills up at 15 students, but it's only got 12 students, we'll add 3 CBE into that class and basically just pay kind of the pro rata. Next is making sure your academic affairs administrators are on board. So understand the differences in the modalities and how the dates and all that kind of stuff. And again, there's a lot of academic affairs folks on here today, so that's great. So then obviously you're president of your college, so they can, when they have conversations with different employers and things like that, really get them to express how the CBE will work for current employees and how you can, get employers can get their employees additional credentials while they're still working, and really show them how that benefit could help, so they don't lose the good employees, keep those around so they don't transfer to somewhere else. As you guys talked about earlier, the welding industry is one of those that's it's a hot commodity. We can't produce enough welders right now to fill the spots. So it's in demand for sure. So the last one on my list there is the board members. So you need to make sure your board members know what's going on, because as they talk to constituents throughout the area, they really need to be able to express, what this, what is CBE, because early on, we got a lot of confusion between CBE and CBD. And so you got to make sure that we're not talking about marijuana, or whatever, THC in the bottle, that kind of stuff. It's something totally different. So making sure those board members understand. So when they talk to people throughout the communities, throughout your entire district, that they are really passing that along to, everybody in their individual areas. So you really have to talk to everybody and explain it to everybody top to bottom. It's a lot of conversations to make sure everybody gets it. So next slide, please. So some of the hurdles that we had to clear are what these next kind of slides go over. So if you go to the next one, please. So like I said, the biggest thing that we were kind of worked through initially was the faculty load part of it. We do everything on the traditional base load kind of model. So trying to figure out how to work those students in. We're still kind of ironing out how we want to do that. But like I said, the open lab design is the best. But again, you run into the problem potentially of a lot of your students wanting to come in at certain hours and nobody coming in during other hours. So that's where you kind of got to work through how that works out to be. So the other thing you could do is potentially do a standalone class where all your CBE students, you can assign one faculty member 15 students, which would be a normal class. And then that faculty member kind of monitors those. But the problem is those students don't necessarily come in at the same time every day, every week. So it's really that rotating. So it's kind of, you got to spread it out among all your faculty members. So that way everybody's getting a little bit of piece of the pie kind of thing. So we're still trying to work through some of that stuff. So the other big hurdle is the National Clearinghouse, like John talked about earlier. When we have students, we try to keep all of our students within the 16-week window. So they're able to start either at the beginning of the semester, 12 weeks in or 8 weeks in, but we try to get them to finish by the end of the semester. We do have the ability to do incompletes and drag it from semester to semester, but we're trying to minimize that as much as humanly possible. The flip side problem of that is when we have students that want to get something done quickly because their employer sending them in to learn a new skill. We really are stuck right now with only being able to defer those degrees at the end of the semester. So we're kind of still trying to figure out how to work through that with the National Clearinghouse and all that kind of stuff. So there is some still a little bit of stuff up in the air. So next slide, please. So when it came to the actual HLC application, the big thing is whoever is in charge of your finance department, they're going to have to do a financial data worksheet, basically illustrate how those finances are going to play in, what are the capital investments and that kind of stuff associated with it. The nice thing about trying to take a current program and convert it to CBE, there won't be a ton of capital investment because all the equipment's there, all that kind of stuff's already there. So just understand that whoever's in charge of your finance on campus will have to fill out one of those worksheets. You'll need to explain the advantages / how the CBE is different than your traditional, which John talked about some of it and some of the other folks talked earlier. It's really about that ability to get students in and out quickly or allow them to work at their own pace. So you really need to show, or you'll have to explain kind of how this different model will allow those people to do that process. So you'll have to describe how the faculty members, what their role is in each class. So you'll have to explain how if a faculty member is in a traditional class and then you have other students that come in and teach other classes, how that faculty member is supposed to work with those students. So one of the big things that we do is we still limit all of our classes, regardless of traditional CBE, whatever. We limit those to 15 students. And so we maintain that 15 to 1 student teacher ratio. And that's how we can say, okay, well, if there's room, the students can come in, but if there's no more booths, they have to come back a different time. So that's how we kind of show that faculty member still maintains that 15-to-1, so they're not overwhelmed with 40 students in the class at one time trying to deal with all that kind of stuff. So one of the things we talked about was kind of how that we maintain that 15-to-1 ratio. So next, you'll have to describe the communication between the faculty members and the students. So again, we use Blackboard for a lot of our stuff. So all the students are assigned a Blackboard shell, even for CBE. All the assignments are listed on there. The entry letter that we give the students is on there. And then that's how we can email the students back and forth, like, hey, haven't seen you in a couple weeks. What's going on? Just want to make sure, we got, 12 weeks left of the semester, make sure if a student will also email us and say, hey, I plan on coming in Thursday night. You think there's going to be space available? Yep. There's only 12 people in that class. Make sure you show up at 5:30, to get, as close to 5:30, make sure there's room, that kind of stuff. So basically explaining how that communication between the students and the faculty members is going to flow is an important part of that. And then the other big part is just describing how the competencies will be assessed. So that's where having that rubric really helps, benefits, and made that process go a lot smoother. Having a breakdown of each competency and what they are in order and that kind of stuff. So again, that's where that Excel sheet that we had each class broken down by competency really made that process go fairly smooth. So next slide, I think. Yeah, that's it. So that pretty much covers the basic of it, obviously, in whatever 30 minutes. Obviously, there's going to be tons of questions, I imagine, but here's my contact information. If anybody wants to take a picture, screenshot, whatever is available. But so Ginger, I've seen some questions pop up, but
yeah. And we'll share the recording in the deck too. So if you don't want to get a hold of Travis otherwise. We had 2 questions so far in the chat. One is how many students have been through or are going through the CBE model, and the second was how long the HLC approval process took.
So right now, like I said, we just started this January with our CBE and the official CBE model. Right now, we have about 18 students that are doing different classes. I've got, I think 3 of those 18 are taking multiple classes. So I'd say half of those are people outside of the college that are new students. And then the other half are current students that are taking advantage of that CBE to be able to process through a little bit faster. So did I see Jill answered something?
Yeah, she answered about the HLC. So just talking about that, they kicked it back for more information a few times. So it took several months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd say all in it probably took 5 or 6 months to get it start to finish from attempt 1 through, I think, maybe a little bit longer.
And then maybe finally we'll have one more. How are you promoting the CBE welding option to students?
So our media services is usually sending that out, but and tries to put it on Facebook and our website and all that kind of stuff. But one, again, like I talked about, talking to your employers that are part of your advisory committee. That's a great way to do it. And then we've got 22 high schools that are in our community college district. 14 of those do dual credit with us. And so I visit all 22 schools, even the ones that don't do dual credit. And I talk about that when I visit the high schools and do recruiting and things like that. So as many people as you can get to talk about it is going to be the best way to do it. So your advisory committee is going to be a great way. Your board members are going to be great ways to do it. Work with your media services folks, talk to your high schools that you work with alongside, get those high school instructors to understand it and really buy into it there, because they're great resources for you.
Thank you so much, Travis. That was just really, really informative. And I know we're going to continue to have more questions. And so thanks for giving your contact information, and I know where to find you. So
yes,
I'm going to be. Thanks so much. Really, really appreciate that. And so now we'll hear how ICC is tackling essential competencies. So Don Kelso, Workforce Equity Project Director, and Marsha Bolden, Workforce Readiness Instructor at Illinois Central College. They're going to talk about the Greater Peoria Essential Abilities and Knowledge, or GPEAK, initiative. So we'll get that other piece of the competencies, get a sense of how they're handling that. So I'll turn it over to you two.
Thank you, Ginger. Appreciate being here today. Just wonderful to hear the presentations. Our work, this isn't a true CBE model, but it is a regional tool that was developed, and we were asked to demonstrate it today. Thought might be helpful for you, especially we have a badging process and assessment tool. That's a nice regional tool that we use, and so we wanted to share that with you. And then Marcia, she utilizes this essential skills training resources that we have in her classroom here with Illinois Central College in our workforce readiness class. So she's going to share a little bit how she's using the tool. If you go to the next slide, Marcia and I are part of the work of the Workforce Equity Initiative grant, and we're in our third year now of WEI. And so when ICCB came out with the WEI grant in 2019, they recommended that all of the schools have essential skills training as part of the grant. And then when the second year grant came out in 2020, it was required that we have the essential skills training. If you go to the next slide, you can see all the 18 participating colleges on WEI. And so I'm hopeful that individuals on this call are kind of hearing from the project directors of WEI that maybe there is some CBE models or training programs, and there's ways that you all can collaborate together to help take care of those essential skills, those competencies that individuals, the WEI participants need to develop. Hopefully there's some collaborations that you can do with those programs. And so if you go to the next slide, when we got that first year grant, 2019 for WEI, it was recommended that we have essential skills training for all the WEI participants. ICC moved to a regional approach to develop an essential skills platform program. And so we went to our Regional Workforce Alliance. They're coordinated by the chamber here. They have a large group. We brought in 85 community members to work on this essential skills platform that we wanted to develop. And then, of course, we brought in the pros from Northern Illinois University Education Systems and Jobs for the Future to help us identify the competencies and things to work on. So if you go to the next slide, we developed GPEAK, stands for Greater Peoria Essential Abilities and Knowledge. And so what is it? What tools did we create? We measure, GPEAK measures, so it's really nice assessment tools that were developed, and I'm going to show you them a little bit here so you can get an idea. And then we also have curricular resources that are very much so career development resources. They encourage the participants to reflect on their growth and development of the essential skills. Then we have GPEAK validates, and so we have a badging system and certificates that we issue to individuals going through GPEAK. And then we serve our community. So as I mentioned, this is a regional tool. And so we're serving employers in our region. We're still kind of in the baby stages here. So we have a couple of employers using it with interns. They're utilizing the tool. We have instructors at ICC utilizing the tool. We have community-based organizations with a couple of cohorts where they're training individuals to get them ready for the workplace, and they're utilizing the tool as well. And then if you go to the next slide, the competencies that we focused on are the 10 technical and essential employability competencies you'd see in the PACE framework as part of the CCPE, the college and career pathway endorsements. Jobs for the Future and NIU Ed Systems had worked on that. And so, and then they were our consultants when we got going with GPEAK. And so we used those same 10 competencies. And then the nice thing about GPEAK, we took our 85 community members and we built performance indicators underneath each of the 10 competencies. And we agreed as employers and community-based organizations, educational partners in the region, we kind of agreed on 5 performance indicators for each competency. So if you go to the next slide, you can see here's the first 4 competencies that we worked on, that we have assessment tools, we'll have journals for students, we have case studies, videos, articles, reflective questions, things that instructors can use in the classroom, things that a supervisor on the job could use. So teamwork, adaptability, cultural competence, and communication across the top, and then the performance indicators underneath. And then the next slide, there's 3 more: problem solving, decision making, critical thinking. And then the last 3 are here. So the language is pretty lofty for students. And so a lot of the work is to unpack the meaning of this employer language, these performance indicators, what the employers are saying they want to see on the job, and to work with students to grow and develop their understanding of these performance behaviors that the employers are looking for, and then to also identify areas where they're really lacking in some experience. Maybe there's just not that much high school experience or clubs and activities, things that they can do. And so what sorts of lessons can the instructors put into their classes to help develop these skills? And then if you go to the next slide, so we have, it's a tool, the GPEAK is a tool of flexible, free and open use resources. If anyone's interested, you can email gpeak@icc.edu if it's helpful in your work that you're doing with your true CBE model. If you'd like to see some of the curricular materials that have been developed, they were developed by Northern Illinois University Center for P through 20 engagement. We also have a couple high schools looking at utilizing them with some of their CTE programs. Everything is reflective learning. So there's case studies, as I mentioned, and everything has the prompts, reflective prompts for you to utilize in the classroom. Then we do some simplified training guides for employers. And so how can they have discussions on the job? How can they assign job tasks that relate to developing the competencies? We have assessment tools in Qualtrics. NIU Ed Systems manages that for us, the assessment tool we utilize. Then we have a platform in Illinois WorkNet. So Southern Illinois University helped develop that for us. And we use Badger. I know there were questions about how to do the digital badges. We use the free platform Badger. We might have to move up to the Badger Pro, but it's still, I think it's $3,000 for Badger Pro. Once we start hitting our capacity levels, we might have to find funds to manage that. And then we're working on community of practice to develop facilitators and instructors. And then you can go to the next slide. Here's our badges. And so there's 10 that they can earn. And like I said, it's issued through Badger. And so the student receives the authentic digital badge, and then they can share via HTML, social media, or link. They can put it in their signature line, etc. We also have fancy certificates we do. And the gold standard GPEAK certification comes when a student earns all 10 badges. And then if you go to the next slide, here's what it looks like in Illinois WorkNet. And if you logged on to Illinois WorkNet, you wouldn't see GPEAK pop up on the main screen. You have to it's in the partner tools section. So you have to become a partner first, which is a pretty simple process. You would email us and we can have you become a partner, and you could use the assessments. But you would basically, step 1, step 2, you can see they're there. You add a mentor, which is the instructor or a supervisor on the job. And then you can send the pre-assessments to the students, to the participants, send a post-assessment. and then you would send the mentor final assessment, and then it comes to the validation process. And so the validators, right now, they're the lead committee for GPEAK. And so we're looking and validating to issue the badges. So the students, if you go to the next slide, I think we have a shot of the assessment tool. A lot of the classes are focusing on probably like three competencies, a semester or cohort, and issuing, pre-assessment, post-assessment. So you can see here a student had selected cultural competence, and then they selected their levels. And then if you go to the next slide, when we go to validate, this is what it looks like. So we're able to see the pre-assessment results, post-assessment results from the student, and then the mentor final assessment from the instructor or the supervisor. They can provide comments, so we would have more detailed comments, and then they upload evidence, so they're putting in classroom assignments right there. And then the instructor is making a recommendation toward the badge, and then we would be able to issue the badge. And then if you go to the next slide, the badges are housed within Illinois WorkNet. The student would still be able to see their badge and their certificates, but underneath it all is Badger, like I mentioned, and it is a free platform that's very nice. I find it to be very excellent, user-friendly. You can upload lists of students that receive the badges, etc., and they're all authenticated. And so it's similar to Credly, but it is a nice platform for that. And then if you go, we are going to have it. One of our sites is the workforce readiness class at Illinois Central College, and they're utilizing GPEAK. So Marcia, can you take it away and tell them a little bit about how you're utilizing it in your class?
Sure. Thank you, Dawn, and great afternoon to everyone. My name is Marcia Bolden, and I serve as one of the lead instructors for workforce equity here at Illinois Central College. So I'll start with this. This initiative focuses on developing our area's workforce by providing participants with a credential and a living wage. We remove barriers and create paths to self-sufficiency. That is really big, a huge theme, and really our mantra in terms of instructors as we're working with students. So briefly, this photo that you have before you, this was a huge day for my class, and this class was with us probably about 2 weeks ago. But our Governor Pritzker, came to Illinois Central College and did a huge press conference. What was nice about it was our students were able to meet with him and really talk about why our programming, why workforce equity, why the readiness classes have been instrumental to them, and also talk about the importance of their next phase, where they're headed, their why am I doing this, the importance and the necessity of being able to earn a family sustainable wage. And so during this visit, a lot of my students talked about, and this was a 6-week readiness class, but they talked about how their confidence had increased, how they had more clarity, how they were more determined to finish the path. Some of them talked about, I've never finished anything that I've started, and now I feel like I have the tools, I have a community to make that happen for me. Dawn, I'm going to have you go to the next slide, if you would. I want to share with our audience, this is a passage of reading that really resonates for me, and it really sets the tone for the why from an instructor's perspective. And it goes like this. If I held a seed in my hand and asked you, what do I have in my hand? What would you say? Perhaps you would answer what seems to be the obvious, a seed. However, if you understand the nature of a seed, your answer would be fact, but not truth. The truth is, I hold a forest in my hand. Why? Because in every seed, there is a tree. And in every tree, there is fruit or flowers with seeds in them. And these seeds also have trees that have fruit, that have seeds, that have trees, that have fruit, they have seeds, and etc. In essence, what you see is not all there is. That is potential, not what is, but what could be. And this passage was from one of my all-time favorite writers and leaders on human potential and leadership. His name is Dr. Miles Monroe. And so really, when we bring in a new cohort of students, for you to have a successful 6-week, 8-week program, we have to really see the potential and what could be, because that's what we're teaching to, that's what we're facilitating for. Typically, my students come from all different backgrounds. And my job as an instructor, really, I like to see myself as a facilitator. And so a lot of that tends to be, really understanding their why they are here, creating that community for them, creating a safe place. I have found that the majority of my students in my class typically have had an unpleasant experience in the academic system. So they're coming to you anxious, nervous, sometimes defensive, because in order to learn, you have to be vulnerable, you have to be transparent. And so it's really important those first couple of weeks of really setting the stage that this is a safe place. We're all starting from ground zero, and that the participation is very much necessary. And so, as Dawn mentioned, we're really using this curriculum and helping our students to learn from using employer language, right? Why is teamwork, adaptability, cultural competence, critical thinking, decision-making, why are those things important to an employer? As a facilitator or an instructor, really your job is to help them to understand the importance and the necessity of working with others. And really big, these last two, the thought process is huge. I can't underscore that enough. When I began to take the approach of saying, the first thing is we really begin to see growth when we begin to work with students about their thoughts and their beliefs. Because they can sit before you and say, hey, I decided I want to become a welder. I want to become, a truck driver. But if they're still operating off of some of those old beliefs and thought patterns, that's not going to be enough to help them to break through whatever those thoughts are that are holding them stuck. So helping students to understand, or work through the problem solving methods, decision making, and critical thinking is huge. The other piece is the self-regulation we focus on in class. And I'm focusing on these things by really using the GPEAK curriculum, if you will. And so, working with them about initiative, self-drive, reliability and accountability, planning and organizing. So we're doing real-time workplace simulated examples and activities in class, but really it's the three things: ensuring that they're working with others, you're focusing on the thought process, are you able to critically think about that? Have you exhausted all of your resources? And then the self-regulation piece. I want to make sure I'm staying on track. So again, we know that after surveying, and holding multitude of focus groups, employers came back and said, hey, these are the 10 competencies that we want to see demonstrated within, our workforce. And so as we look at technology is huge. We're seeing some new trends and transformative technology, applying for the job, taking assessments, receiving your standard work. All of that comes into place. And so oftentimes when students come in, many of them aren't as comfortable with using technology, checking emails, pulling your instructions from an email, and really just navigating the computer. So we spend quite a bit of time in really helping students to become comfortable with the computer, working through it, taking assessments, writing emails, writing summaries, reports, you know, everything that we can do to really give them a jump start in being comfortable and successful in a working environment. You know, and I don't care what industry you look at, that student will be required to access technology of some sort. The other piece is creating digital technology. Creating digital literacy. So again, as you're saying, hey, did you check your email? There's been a change, you know, or did you go to that file or that drive to pull off today's report? They need to be comfortable in navigating and if nonetheless be able to use those critical thinking skills to access that information. Next slide, Dawn. Okay, so what you have in front of you, these are a few industries that we've actually built cohorts around. So I mentioned earlier, I'll have students that are going into the transportation field, health careers, manufacturing, HVAC, construction, or IT. And so GPEAK really allows us to focus on those essential skills or power skills or life skills. We've heard different terms be used. However, depending on the industry, we've also customized the cohort, the curriculum, if you will. And so what we've done, we've talked to employers to find out if you're going into trucking, what are some things that you're going to need to know? And so in my class, we will do research about the industry. We'll look at jobs, we'll look at salaries, education levels. I mean, we'll do a full-fledged exploration on that industry. So students are very clear about, you know, the industry that they selected, what are the demands and the trends. So as we looked at COVID, you know, which has really created us to think about how we work with others differently. And so, but to also look at that from an employer standpoint, what are the needs? Well, they need drivers, you know, safety is going to be key. And so students are able to begin to research to find out, you know, why are those things important? How are they impacting the bottom line for that employer? In addition to the manufacturing environment, so I teach a readiness class. We use GPEAK. I'm working with them to build their math skills, as well as their reading comprehension and sentence skills. And so we also at ICC have incorporated a few other programs. Confit is another software that I use to help students to really begin to develop proficiency. So, you know, my students come to me, I may have a student who is testing at a 3rd or 4th grade level, sitting next to someone who's maybe operating at a 12th grade level or higher. So as a facilitator, I have to be very creative in creating opportunities for us all to work and together, but also to allow that student to begin to work on some of those areas where they need a little more proficiency. And so Confit really has been my go-to. It allows the student to take an assessment and then it will build many lessons to help that student to begin to develop that proficiency. You know, so maybe their ability to do fractions, converting them to decimals is low. That software will then develop many lessons for them to work in to begin to, you know, increase that knowledge area. In addition to the manufacturing piece, I also teach Six Sigma to my students. And so we do a lot of terminology building, looking at keywords, definitions. You know, I have them write it in a sentence. How do you use that term in a sentence? I am really heavy on the 5S methodology, you know, which really talks about safety, making sure things are organized and how that works in a manufacturing type of environment. With the Six Sigma focus, we also assign a modified Six Sigma project. Again, so when my students complete my class, they are able to speak the language, and they're also able to talk about why those things are important in a manufacturing environment. And it's the same thing for construction. There's some other special pieces that we would add. So when that student transitions from my class and they're going through their training or into an actual job, they're able to really understand that environment and speak the language. Slide, please. Okay, so the art of facilitation. Let me go to my notes here. So what works? Here's what has worked for me. One, you really have to be able to pivot, to shift, and sometimes you have to do an about face. I think above all else, you have to have fun. You really have to enjoy what you do. I really get a full workout in my class because my students are coming in at different levels, okay? But I have found what is universal, the more you can get them to share their experiences, but you're facilitating that conversation and you're using GPEAK or whatever that subject is you're focusing on, you're using that as the backdrop, but you're asking them to share their experiences. Can you tell me a time when you had to use problem solving on the job? What was that like for you? The other piece in terms of results from my facilitation, here's what I'm looking for. I'm not going to tell you I'm here to make them smarter. I mean, I hope so. If they do the work, that's an automatic. But really, I am here to help them build their confidence, help them to utilize their tools, okay? Help them to feel more confident about asking questions, becoming more organized. And GPEAK is so wonderful because it lays it out there, but you're able to customize your lesson plans to fit your class. So there have been times that, I've had my lesson plans ready, but depending on the makeup of my class, at a drop of a hat, I have to customize. I may have to modify a lesson because, maybe that class, they all are not, performing at the same rate. Some are maybe moving a little slower. So I'll find that I'll need to adjust it a little bit so that we can move through lessons as a group together. Let's see, what else do I have here? Creating trust. I think the more that you are clear about the expectations, and there's a lot of repetitive reinforcement that we do. I like to build cheat sheets and tools for my students. And so I'll have a syllabus, but I may add hyperlinks to it so they can get to Confit easier. They can get to their GP a lot easier. So just keeping my student in mind, because we can give a whole lot of papers like I have here, right? And I have my screen. But I try to make it as organized and easy for them to access their materials, to turn in assignments. I've incorporated Google Forms. So weekly, I am having my students to complete a weekly reflection assignment. It's a Google form, and basically I'm asking maybe 5 questions. What were your takeaways from this week? How could you, from what you learned, how could you incorporate that day to day? How could you incorporate it personally? How could you incorporate that professionally? What is one question you had about the article or the assignment this week? So on a weekly basis, I can go through that data that I've collected just to find out, am I on target? Is there a different type of activity that I'm getting something here. Is there a different type of activity that I may need to incorporate just to make sure I am helping those students connect to the material? So weekly, I'm taking the temperature of my class as it relates to assignments. But through the facilitation, I'm looking at faces. I'm walking the room. I am constantly asking, are you okay? Are you good? But I'm also requiring the participation. Something else that I do, the old fashioned, can you see this? Tickets, the carnival tickets. I'm really big on participation. And so with them participating, they get a ticket. Usually there's an end of week drawing. And this is something that I have added because I think it's important. I'll go get them a little $5 gift card. So I buy one for each week and I'll do a drawing. And so that is encouraging participation. You know, so the more tickets you put in, the chances are you may, you know, have an incentive. That's just what has worked for me as an instructor. And lastly, in the art of facilitation, you're really using multiple roles. You know, you're creating synergy. You're serving as a conductor, a catalyst, a coach, just a good listener. You're sometimes referring them to other places in the college or in your organization for referrals. So, you know, you're wearing multiple roles. And so I go back to, as a facilitator, you must pivot, shift, and sometimes do an about face. But it's really just bringing that good energy to class and seeing your students' potential, even if they can't see it for themselves. As their coach or their facilitator, you hold that for them. And I promise you, they will rise up to that standard. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Marcia. I think we're gonna close out.
Okay, and I think that you've touched on the other pieces with the journals and case studies. So Dawn, I'll wrap up. I don't know if there are questions that I could answer, and this is just the happy faces from my class. And this is a class of truck drivers. I have a pharmacist, a LPN, and a welder that you're seeing. They're moving on to their next. Thanks for your time. It's been my pleasure to share.
Thank you. Thank you both. Thanks so much, Dawn and Marcia. That was really, really helpful and informative. So we have a question about outdoor-based competency programs.
Horticulture's, I mean, you can do stuff outside of just your outside plant stuff too. I mean, if you were able to get your greenhouse going, there's a lot of plant propagation stuff that you could do in the greenhouse throughout the, you know, off season, basically. We did a lot of poinsettia work, and then we would transfer a lot of plants into our greenhouse during the winter season. And you could, as long as you can maintain that, I mean, there's some, obviously some intricacies that would go into that, but we would either move them into our greenhouse or move them into our ag shop, and then, you know, add heat lamps or lighting and that kind of stuff to make stuff grow off season. But I mean, there's stuff out there, but basically the biggest thing when you're trying to figure out what competencies to do, break down what you want those students to have at the end of it, do kind of a backwards design. So once you figure out what that is, then you can kind of figure out when would be the best time to do each of those competencies throughout the school year. So maybe kind of shift stuff around based on what season, you know, things are doing, and, you know, that kind of stuff.
Thanks, Travis. We've definitely heard over and over as we've been talking to people how key it is to start at the end and work backward with any of these things. Well, thanks. Thanks everybody for really, really informative and exciting session. I appreciate all of our presenters and ICCB for letting us help with these things. It's really exciting work to me. And so you will be hearing more from us. And thanks for coming. Check the website. I'll send out the recording and the deck. So all good. Feel free to contact us at Ed Systems. Travis gave you his information too. We're around. Have a great rest of your day.